Hello, everyone. Welcome back for the second part of a two-part web-based training on cost-benefit analysis for justice policy. If you don't already know, my name is Laura Kerslich. I'm a policy analyst at the Vera Institute of Justice. Vera is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization based in New York City. This year, Vera is celebrating the 50th anniversary of its mission to make justice systems fairer and more effective through research and innovation. I'm here today with Mike Wilson, economist for the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission and director of the state Statistical Analysis Center. Mike's created a cost-benefit model of Oregon's criminal justice system and presented this model nationally to criminal justice professionals. We're delighted to have Mike here. We're also delighted to have you here. We're glad that you came back for the second part in this two-part training on cost-benefit analysis and justice policy. Today's training is brought to you by the letters CBKB, or Cost Benefit Knowledge Bank for Criminal Justice. CBKB is a project of the Vera Institute funded by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. We're building a community of practice on cost-benefit practice at our website, cbkb.org. You can stop by after this training to sign up for updates or learn about upcoming events. You can also listen to other webinars or podcasts with experts in the field. So moving into today's webinar agenda, Mike will begin by reviewing 3 data tables which provide a foundation for the cost-benefit examples that we'll discuss later in this presentation. We'll then move on to 2 specific examples, the first more technical than the next. You should have your handout easily accessible, as Mike will refer to it quite a bit during this training. As during part 1, we'll designate 10 minutes at the end of the training for question and answer, but Mike will occasionally stop and ask for questions. So have your questions ready. And speaking of questions, I want to let you know that there will be a couple of ways to ask questions during this webinar. You can use the chat feature at the bottom left side of your screen. I'm showing it there with the green arrow, to type to us a question at any point during the webinar. Our Vera staff will be manning the chat feature to answer your questions. You can also use the Raise Your Hand feature, which is at the top left side of your screen. I'm showing it now with the green arrow, to ask a question directly to Mike during the webinar. I will tell you how to unmute your phone lines when we get to the question and answer periods during the webinar and at the end. We'll only take Raise Your Hand questions during these question and answer periods, so please be patient. Here are some additional housekeeping items. For webinar support and troubleshooting, please see the information on your screen. Next, I want to remind you that you should have a handout, as I've already mentioned, for this webinar in your registration materials. If you do not already have the handout available, please take a moment to download it from your registration or reminder emails. Lastly, you should know that this webinar is recorded and will be posted online. You'll receive an email after the webinar is recorded with the slides and any other information that may be helpful to you. Before we begin today, I'll take a quick moment to keep us focused on the goal of this two-part training. As you know, the training is designed to help you build cost-benefit capacity in your own state. You're learning how cost-benefit analysis can be used to assess your jurisdiction's return on investment from criminal justice spending. You're also learning how costs and benefits are calculated. And as many of you mentioned in your evaluation from the first part of the training, you're here to learn how to practically apply cost-benefit in your jurisdiction, and that's what we'll be doing today with the examples that I mentioned earlier. To quickly recap what we've already gone through in part 1, you deconstructed costs to their component parts, which include cost, probability, and sentencing distributions, and you learned about effect sizes and how to apply them to cost-benefit analysis. Today, as I mentioned, you will calculate the cost of a single offense, an assault, and you will build a cost-benefit model of an Oregon drug court and learn how to use CBA in decision-making. So that's all for my introduction. Mike, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And hello, everyone, again. I'm assuming most of you are returning from the last one we did last Tuesday, so probably don't need to do too many introductions for myself. But I'm Mike Wilson, work with the Oregon Criminal Justice Commission. And today we're going to go into a little bit more detail. Last time we did kind of a higher level overview of cost-benefit analysis, why we would use it, kind of how we would gather the data that we would need, and kind of putting that data together. So today we're going to go really just I'm going to spend most of the time going through 2 examples, and hopefully we can answer some of the questions that some of you had last time of kind of getting into a little more detail of how you can apply this in your own jurisdiction. So the first few tables here are slides we went over last time, just refreshing our memory of the information that we need to start off to do a cost-benefit analysis. And table 1, which is also in your handout, so it'd be good for you to keep the handout handy on your desk, because I'll be referring to it quite a bit through this presentation. The first handout is the criminal justice costs in Oregon, and these are examples of the estimates we did in Oregon, or in some cases we borrowed from Washington, looking at not only different taxpayer costs, some of which are state costs, some of which are local costs, but also looking at victimization costs, which was found in a recent national study that's been done. So you can see that we've broken it down by different components, but we've also broken it down by different crime types. And if you remember from last discussion, this was so that we could look at different programs that might have different impacts across various crime types. For example, if we were to do drug and alcohol treatment, we would expect to avoid more drug and alcohol crimes than if we were to do sex offender treatment program, which we would expect to avoid more sex offender type crimes. So the costs of those crimes are much different depending on the sentence lengths and distributions of how people move through the system in your state. So the first table is we're going to be referring back to, and it's really sort of the foundation of doing any sort of cost-benefit work. You need to have an estimate of what the costs are for the various components in your state. And then the second part, you need to really know how offenders move through the system in your jurisdiction. So when we're looking at an offense, sometimes those are reported to police, sometimes they aren't. If they're reported, they may or may not result in an arrest. The arrest may or may not result in a conviction, down to whether or not they're going to spend time in prison and for how long, or if they're in local jails or probation. So each state, the way an offender moves through the system is going to vary by quite a bit. So this is important information that's going to be necessary for you to do this type of analysis in your own state. So this is really just the numbers. Table 2 are really the numbers of the tree diagram we had in the previous slide. And these numbers can be gathered, I think, fairly easily in most states, because here we're gathering the uniform crime data to figure out number of offenses. We're using our own state data to look at conviction, so we can begin to figure out what the probabilities are of moving across the system. So if you have an offense, what's the likelihood that you're going to be arrested? If you're arrested, what's the likelihood that you're going to be convicted? And I had a question last time about the top row there. And let's see if you can look at the probability of a conviction for a homicide was over 100%. And I had a question of, well, how could we have over 100%? And there are a couple of issues there with some of the data. Some of the arrests could be in one time period. So you have an arrest in 2009, but the conviction for that arrest might not be until the next year. So you can have variations over time. Then the other issue you have is there could be one murder, but you could have multiple people that commit that murder. So you could have more than one person that's convicted in one offense. So there's a few cases, you see that mainly with homicide, that are over 100%. In that case, I force it in the model to equal to 100%. So we don't have a probability greater than 1 of that happening. But I just wanted to point that out because I know I got some questions on that last time. So moving on, so now we get to the bottom of that tree diagram we had, and once we figure out what the likelihood of someone is moving all the way through the system to conviction, then we need to get an estimate of how much of each resource are they going to use. So given that an offender is convicted, this is going to vary, again, largely across states. If you commit a homicide, you're much more likely to go to prison. You can see that in Oregon. It's 92% of the time you're going to go to prison. Now, if you look at drug offenses in Oregon, you're not very likely to go to prison as a result of a drug offense. Less than 1 out of 10 will spend time in prison. And so once you figure out how likely they are to use each of those resources, then you need to know how long they're going to be in each of those places. So homicide is, if they go to prison for around 20 years. For a drug or property offender, it's around 2 years if they go to prison. So those are really important pieces of information to get at what's going on in your system. How often are people going to prison, and when they go to prison, how long do we expect them to be there? So I don't know if we have any questions. That's just a real quick review from last time. I don't know if there were any lingering questions from last time or anything I covered here that brings up any questions.
Sure, Mike, and it might be helpful if I just briefly describe how we're going to take questions
Sure.
today's webinar. So if you do have a question right now, you can go ahead and raise your hand. And when I guess call on your name, you can go ahead and unmute your phone line by pressing *7 on your phone. And we'll do that for all the question answer periods. And you can also use the chat feature if you'd like. But for now, Mike, it looks like we don't have any questions.
Okay. Sounds good. And that was just a review from last time, so it must have all made perfect sense last time. So we'll move on.
Yeah.
So I want to spend some time today going over a couple of different examples. And the first example I have here is calculating the cost of an offense. So really, the reason I'm giving this example is to show how the probabilities work together to get a cost of something happening. In reality, very rarely are you going to be trying to estimate the cost of an offense, because if you're looking at an outcome, really there's not very many outcome studies that you're going to look at the cost of an offense. Maybe if you're looking at incarceration and the impact on crime, you might be able to get that sort of estimate. But typically, when you're looking at the effectiveness of a drug and alcohol treatment or cognitive behavioral therapy, something like that, you're going to have your outcome measure is going to be fewer arrests or fewer convictions. So you're not normally going to start at an offense. But I think this example will be helpful in seeing how we kind of put together the probabilities and the costs. So if you remember back, we had in Table 1, we had the different types of costs. So we had cost to victims, which, remember, aren't going to be taxpayer costs, so they won't make an impact on general fund dollars. We have a cost for arrest, conviction, then once they're convicted, the adult side, the jail side, and probation, post-prison supervision. So we have all of those in our Table 1, the different levels of costs that we've measured and estimated. And so we want to go through and estimate what is the cost of an assault. So if we're able to avoid an assault, or if we have some program that causes an assault, we can then estimate how much the costs are as a result of that. So, whoops, sorry, I skipped ahead a couple there. So if we go back to the victimization portion, and we can really just read that right off of the first table, because we know we have one offense, and we can read off that table from the national study that says we've had about $8,000 in out-of-pocket expenses and around $12,000 in quality of life estimate. So we have about $20,000 costs associated with an assault on the victimization cost, and that just comes straight from the national victimization study, cost of victimization that we've used. So moving on to the next part of the criminal justice system. So if there's an offense, remember, it's not always going to even be reported to the police. And if it's reported to the police, it's not always going to result in an arrest. So using our probabilities from Table 2, and you should have that handout there in front of you, you can see that the probability of an arrest is 32%. So we can then multiply that out. So cost of an arrest is $670. The probability of an arrest happening if there's an offense is 32%. We get a total cost of an arrest of $214. And we can do the same thing moving through this example to the cost of a conviction. Again, pulling information off of the first table, that we have the cost of a conviction for an assault of around $5,000. And we can look in Table 2, and this is highlighted for you in Table 2, that the probability of a conviction is 15%. So again, we multiply those two numbers together. We know what the cost of a conviction is, around $5,000. We know how likely an offense is to end in a conviction, and we multiply those two together. We get a total cost to the criminal justice system in terms of the courts and the district attorneys and the defenders of around $732. So that gets us to the point of we've measured or estimated what the costs are to the victims, straight from a national study. We've looked at how in our state, how people move through the system, how likely an offense is to end in an arrest, and then we've looked at how likely an offense is to end in a conviction, so we can get estimates for the cost for an arrest and for a conviction. Now we want to get an idea of how much does it cost for adult corrections. Now if we go back and we look, we remember that if there's an offense, there's a 15% chance that that offense is going to end in a conviction. Now we look onto Table 3 and we can see how offenders move through the system in Oregon. And we can see that 35% of the time that conviction in Oregon will result in a prison sentence. So we can start to multiply through to figure out how likely an offense is to end in a prison sentence. If we were to multiply that 0.15 by that 0.35, we would get the probability that an offense will end in a prison sentence. So once we are looking at once we have an idea of how likely someone is to use that prison resource, we want to know how much the prison resource costs. And again, looking back at Table 1, you can see that that prison cost is around $14,000. We talked about this last time, that we got that estimate from talking with the Department of Corrections budget folks and with the Legislative Fiscal Office, and worked through to say, well, it's around, we think a marginal cost for a year in prison was around $13,851. So it's the best estimate we have at this point. Now we can look through how offenders move through the system in Oregon, and we can say if someone is convicted for an assault and goes to prison in Oregon, they serve roughly 4 years in prison. And so putting all that together along with what economists typically use to discount future dollars, we have a 3% discount rate. And the reason for that is future dollars don't have the same value as money today. And in the budget environment we're in right now, 3% might be a really low number. Some of the Legislative Fiscal Office folks, I'm sure would put a much higher discount rate on future savings compared to today's cost. So, but typically 3% is a standard rate that is used for this type of analysis. So when we're avoiding costs or we're seeing costs happen out into future years, we can discount them back to present dollars using this 3% discount rate. So going through sort of the math of this, and Excel will do this for you, so you don't have to do this. I mean, some of these get fairly complicated when you're looking at 20-year sentences, going out and discounting these. But there's formulas you can just type into Excel to do this pretty quickly. But looking at a 4-year sentence at a cost of around $14,000 a year for a year in prison, we can estimate what the present value is of an assault offender getting a prison sentence. And when we do the math of that, it comes out to a little over $51,000. Now we put that together. Remember that this $51,000 is calculating a 4-year sentence for an assault offender. But remember that only 15% of assault offenses actually end in a conviction. And once they end in a conviction, only 35% get a prison sentence. So when you multiply those three numbers together, the 0.15 times the 0.35 multiplied by our $51,000 estimate, it gets us a total cost of incarceration for an assault offense of around $2,700. So we can use this same type of formula. So this was an example of the prison costs. But if you go back and you look in Table 3, you see that we have similar lengths of sentence lengths for probation and local control, which is our jail for felony sentences. And we have the similar sentence length for post-prison supervision. So we can do the same sort of calculation for all of these different components. And when we do that, we can put them all together and sum them up. And we see the total cost of one assault in Oregon is around between $25,000 and $26,000. So once we have this estimate, we can then go across, and we can do this across different crime types. This example was for an assault, but we can use this same type of methodology to look at robberies, to look at property crimes, to look at drug crimes, And we're going to have different costs for each of these because each of them uses different parts of the criminal justice system. If you're in Oregon, I've mentioned before, is you have a drug crime, you're very unlikely to get a prison sentence. And if you do go to prison, it's not for very long. So you can see you get much less savings to the system if you avoid a drug crime than if you avoid a homicide, for example. So that's the first example we're going through. And so I'm sure there's some questions as I went through that. Some of the going through the math of this over the phone is a little bit difficult, but I'm hopefully it's making sense as I go.
Yep. So just a reminder, you can go ahead and raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll call on you, and you can unmute your phone line by pressing *7. Mike, I'll take the first question since it looks like there may not be any hands raised right now. But at the end of the last presentation, you talked about effect sizes.
Yeah.
So could you link in that discussion about effect sizes to this example on the cost of a crime?
Sure. And I think this is it's really a question that will be answered with our next example with the drug courts. But typically, an effect size is just measuring how effective a program is at reducing crime. And normally, if we're going to look at an outcome measure for a program, it's going to have to be something we can easily measure, like if you have a drug treatment program, you can look at those offenders compared to similar offenders and see how the recidivism patterns differ. Now, if we were to look at arrests, we could look at how many are arrested of the people that got the drug and alcohol treatment and how many were arrested of a similar group that didn't get it. And you can get an effect size there to say how effective a program is at reducing crime. Now, you want to take that effect size and then apply it back to this type of analysis so we can see how many crimes we expect to avoid by investing money in a certain program. And that's what we'll get into in this drug court example. When we look at the previous example I gave you of avoiding an assault offense, typically you aren't going to have an outcome measure of offenses because not all offenses are reported to the police. It's harder to measure. So typically your starting point is probably felony conviction or conviction. Sometimes it'll be arrest. And the neat thing about building a model like this, when we have different probabilities, you can start at different points in the model. So if you're starting with an arrest, you can figure out the probability from arrest to conviction, or if you're starting from a conviction, you can go back and figure out how many arrests it takes to get to a conviction.
Thanks, Mike. That's great. It's good to be able to link the two webinars or to do trainings like that. We don't have any questions right now, so why don't you continue on to the next example?
Okay, sounds good. So the second example, I think this is really where all this gets put together, where we can look at a program and say, how beneficial is that program given the amount that we've invested in? And so I've chosen a program here, drug courts, we have quite a bit of funding for drug courts in Oregon, and it's it's a program that's been researched more than most. And so it's a good example, but it's also a difficult example because it's messier, and you'll see as we go through it, it's messier than if we're looking at something like drug and alcohol treatment in prison, where you know exactly how many state dollars are going toward it. You know what, if they aren't in drug court or they aren't in drug treatment in prison, then they're not getting other services. So it's easier to figure out the cost and where the dollars are coming from. With drug courts, it's much more difficult because offenders that aren't in drug court are still being supervised, and they still might be receiving some treatment, and they're still getting services that they. So it's not drug court compared to nothing. It's drug court compared to business as usual, which isn't always easy to measure. And then there's many different funding streams for drug court. So I'll get into it as we go through it. But I think it's an interesting example, and it shows you. Hopefully, it'll show you some of the messiness of doing this type of cost-benefit analysis. That it's not always as simple and easy as you'd want it to be, but I think is a good example of showing kind of how we go about evaluating a program like this. So in Oregon, we're going to look at what's the impact of 100 drug court participants. So we want to see if that's cost beneficial, and if so, we have to sort of think through at the beginning of whose perspective are we going to look at here. Are we going to look at the state perspective, so how many state dollars are invested compared to how many state taxpayer dollars are invested, or are we going to look more globally and say, what is the impact on this of all citizens in Oregon? Are we only looking at the criminal justice side, or are we going to look at foster care and other areas? And so we talked about some of these issues last time. In Oregon, we typically we've only looked at criminal justice related outcomes, and we've typically looked at felony convictions because we don't have good data on misdemeanors. But there's a lot of different ways you can do it. So you want to think about that when you're going to start off a cost-benefit analysis like this. So the first question, we talked about effect sizes, is we want to know, do we have an evaluation of drug courts in our state? So it says here no. Actually, we have just completed a drug court evaluation in Oregon, but it was completed right around a week ago, so didn't really have time to get the results in here. So if we don't have a drug court evaluation or whatever the program is you're looking at, then you can look at a meta-analysis. And again, we discussed this last time. A meta-analysis basically looks at all the research that's out there and tries to estimate how effective a program is based on all the work that's been done on that program. So drug courts, like I said, have been evaluated pretty extensively. And looking at the Washington State Institute of Public Policy did a meta-analysis, and they found an effect size of around 12% for drug courts. It was based on 57 different studies. So then we have this effect size. So there's other things that we need to, other decisions we need to make as we are putting this model together. So one is there a decay rate? Do we think that programs decay over time, meaning is a drug court less effective 5 years from now than it is from today? Is it going to have the same impact on avoiding crime way out into the future? Another question we need to decide is what crimes are we going to apply it to? This is that question of, does it apply to misdemeanors or felonies only? We can also think about foster care. Does it have an impact on foster care? Does it have an impact on other treatment services within the state system? Those get more difficult to measure, especially if you're a criminal justice agency. It's harder often to get data outside of your agency. So those are questions, though, to figure out if you have the data available, and if you do you want to analyze it in that way? And then finally, another question is, how many years out does the program measure recidivism? Meaning, if you want to look at a drug court, do you want to look at, is it effective? If a 20-year-old gets it, do we want to look at have an estimate for the next 50 years of their life, how much crime that we think will be avoided? Or do we want to look at 3 years, like you would typically think of recidivism rates are measured, and for the Department of Corrections typically looks at 3-year recidivism rates. So those are questions that need to be answered kind of at the start of a study like this. And again, whose perspective matters? Do you want to look at state money, all funding? Do you want to compare it to an alternative, compare it to business as usual? Or are you going to look at just the cost of that drug court? And typically you want to compare the cost of an intervention or some program you're doing to what they would be getting otherwise. So you want to normally compare it to business as usual to the extent you can measure that and find that data. So so this kind of brings up the example in Oregon, which makes this analysis a little bit difficult when we start off here, is looking at how much state funding goes to drug courts, because we have I mean, that's a pretty easy thing to measure, but we also have a lot of other funding in drug courts. So we know state funding, we don't know local funding as well. We know how many participants there are, so we can estimate the dollar amount of state funding, but it gets more difficult when we're looking at local funding. And then we want to compare it to business as usual, which would be probation, but we don't know typically probation. Sometimes if you're diverting a prison sentence for a drug court, then it's a different estimate, but typically it's going to be probation, which has costs associated with it as well. So it's wanting to look at the cost of drug court compared to the cost of business as usual. And again, this is I guess just kind of a repeat of what we had said earlier. We want to clarify at the beginning of what costs we're looking at and what exactly we're measuring. So let's get into the numbers, and a lot of information in Table 4. But really what this is showing is a recidivism pattern of people who were convicted of drug and property crimes in 1997. So as what I did is I followed these people for 10 years to look at what their recidivism patterns were. And the reason I used drug and property offenders is because they're typically the type of offender that would be in a drug court. So I wanted to find an offender that was like someone that would get drug court but didn't get drug court, and follow them for a 10-year period so I could look at what their criminal behavior looked like. So in this case, we had looks like about 5,700 people. If you look in the, let's see here, if I can use my markup tool here. So if you look at the number of people that were sentenced to probation in 1997 in Oregon for drug and property crimes, it was around 5,700. So I followed those people. I looked at in the data for 10 years to see how many felony convictions they had in these different crime categories over that 10-year period. And you can see that while almost 2,200 of them recidivated, 38% recidivism rate as defined as a felony reconviction over that 10-year period, I allowed for them to recidivate more than once. So you can see in the bottom corner of that table, the number of 4,663, that's how many felony convictions were committed by those 2,200 offenders that recidivated. So I'm creating just a recidivism pattern that is similar to what we would expect for drug court offenders. So Table 5 is really just the same information that we had in Table 4. I've just normalized it to 100 offenders. Because remember, we were looking at what was the impact of 100 offenders going through a drug court. So I've normalized this. So Table 5 is really just multiplying Table 4 by 100 divided by 5,697, which were the number of releases in our group. So it's identical information, just normalized to 100 drug court participants. Now Table 6 is where we get into using our effect size. So remember I said the effect size that we estimated for drug courts was 12%, and actually a little bit less than that. But we expect from the literature that drug courts would would reduce recidivism by around 12%. Now I've included what we call a decay rate here. And what that's showing is that drug courts in year 1 are more effective than they are in year 2. And they decay by, I think that the number I used here was around 2.5%. So I allowed there to be a decay rate, meaning that they were less effective over time. Really, there isn't much evidence that I've seen either way whether or not we should use a decay rate. I'm still kind of on the fence of whether or not we should include one. But it's one of those decisions you have to make as you go through. Using the decay rate makes your estimates a little more conservative. So if you get questioned on, are you assuming that drug courts are just as effective today as they were before? You say no, we're assuming a decay rate, meaning that an offender that goes through a drug court 10 years ago, that the effectiveness of that drug court probably wears off over time. Now I've heard other people argue that it's the other way around, that as time goes on, the effects of drug courts grow. There hasn't been enough research that I've seen to say definitively if it's one way or the other. So I typically have put a decay rate in to make more of a conservative estimate, but it would also be reasonable to leave a decay rate out because there's not a lot of research on that I've seen. So as what I've done then in Table 6 is I've taken that effect size and multiplied that by the recidivism patterns that we saw before to get an estimate of how many crimes we expect to avoid through a drug court. So if you see at the bottom right corner of this table, the 8.83, this is telling us that 100 drug court participants over a 10-year period, we would expect to avoid almost 9 felony convictions. So now that we've got an estimate of how much of each crime type we've avoided, looking at the effectiveness of drug courts, we can then use our cost estimates that we've done in the previous slides to get an idea of how many avoided costs we had for each felony conviction. And we can also look at the victimization costs that we've avoided as well. So the costs that we've calculated before now become our benefit because we're avoiding crime into the future, and the cost of that crime becomes a benefit to these programs. So Table 7 is taking our cost data, our probability data, and our sentence data. So really taking tables 1, 2, and 3 and merging those together to put this into costs of an adult felony conviction. And it takes a little while to go through all the math of Table 7, and we don't have time in this short webinar to do that. But really that's what it's doing. It's taking tables 1, 2, and 3 and combining them. If you look, for example, on the assault Department of Corrections costs, remember from the example we did before, it was around $51,000 for an assault, for one assault going to prison. So it was around a 4-year sentence at around $14,000 a year. But it was only a 38% or 35% chance that that person got a prison sentence. So that box that I've kind of highlighted there, that 17,822, is that 51,000 that we calculated earlier multiplied by the probability that a conviction ends up in prison, gets us to that roughly $18,000 mark. So this table takes our probability distributions, tables 1, 2, and 3, combines them because my drug court evaluations are typically looking at how many felony convictions have I avoided. So I want to normalize my data so that I'm looking at the cost of an adult felony conviction. So, and this just kind of describes what I was telling you in the previous table, that really we've combined these 3 tables and to get Table 7 so that we can look at a program like drug courts, that we can say this is how many felony convictions we expect it to avoid. We can then normalize our costs into the cost of a felony conviction, so we can multiply those out to get the benefit of the program. So as we move on here to slide to Table 8, now Table 8 is looking at the estimated taxpayer benefits of these 100 drug court participants. So this is multiplying together Table 7, multiplying together Table 7, our cost of a felony conviction, with Table 6, which is our estimated convictions that we avoided for the drug court cost. So it's just taking how many felonies we think we've avoided and now multiplying what the cost of those felonies are to taxpayers in terms of more arrests, more convictions, more time in prison, more probation. Now we can do that same thing in Table 9, looking at victimization costs. So we've done that same exact thing. We looked at how many felony crimes we think we've avoided by drug courts. We can then assign dollar values, which are found in Table 7, on how much the victimization costs are for a felony conviction for these different crime types, and we can multiply those out and get an estimate of the total benefit or total avoided victimization costs. So finally, we can put all this together. When we add those previous tables together, we can see that the total benefit per participant was around $4,100. So the taxpayer benefits plus the victimization benefits are around $4,100. Now, this example continues to be a little bit difficult because we then have to estimate the total cost per participant in Oregon. And we've looked at this a couple of different ways, and as I described earlier, this is a difficult thing to estimate for drug courts in Oregon because they're funded from the state, they're funded locally, there's some federal money that goes to them as well. And the way we gather our data, it isn't always easy to track those different costs. So that's one issue that makes the cost difficult. A second issue that makes it difficult, as I described before, is we want to compare, our effect sizes are compared to business as usual. So we also want to compare the costs to business as usual. but it isn't always, there isn't always a statewide estimates for what are the costs of business as usual for drug-addicted offenders who are on probation. So we've looked at this and we've estimated a couple different ways using some research of NPC, which is a drug court evaluation consulting firm in Oregon, and they've done drug court evaluations around the country. So we've used some of their data. We've looked at Washington did a drug court evaluation where they try to do a more detailed cost analysis of it. And we've looked at how much we fund as a state and kind of melded those together to try to come up with a reasonable cost. Now, the range of that cost has been $2,000 to $4,000 per participant. So you can see with this example, if you have the lower end, drug courts are quite cost beneficial, but if you use the higher end of cost, they're really close to breaking even. Now, so it makes it a little messy trying to say what you do with those numbers. Now we also have an evaluation that I said has just been completed, a statewide evaluation in Oregon, one of the biggest studies that's been done on drug courts. And we came up with an effect size of over 20% in that evaluation. So moving forward, we're also going to have to decide what effect size do we use. We have a effect size from the literature that says 12% or so for the effect size, but we've done our own in-state evaluation that says drug courts appear to be more effective, more like 22%. Now, if we were to plug those in, we would have, instead of $4,000 in benefits, it'd be close to doubling those benefits. So there's a decision that we're going to have to figure out of how do we meld those effect sizes from the literature with effect sizes from our studies we've done in our own state. So I guess this example, while not as easy for me to present on, it'd be easier to present on a really clean example that we know the costs are very concrete, easy to measure, and we don't have a business as usual that we have to compare to. It'd be an easier example to present, but I think this one hopefully shows you a little bit of the messiness of all of this. Now, when it came time to fund drug courts, typically, I mean, this cost-benefit work has been presented, and it's usually well received. And I think a lot of the research that's been done around drug courts has helped in Oregon, where I think they're very popular. And as the legislature has continued to try to fully fund drug courts. Now, this last session, as we got federal money, they cut drug court money because they knew the federal money could backfill them. It'll be interesting to see. We're going to have our governor's budget will just be released here in the next couple of weeks, and the legislature obviously will have to decide how much money is going to be going to drug courts in the near future. So it's an interesting time to see sort of how this information is going to play into the decisions of the legislature. In the past, they have continued to fund drug courts and have been very happy with the work and research that's been done around them. But you can see doing this cost-benefit analysis, trying to come up with a definitive number, which usually policymakers like, sometimes proves to be difficult. So that's the drug court example. I felt as I was going through that a few times I kind of wanted to stop and ask questions because there's so much, but I wanted to get through it so we didn't get bogged down. And so we have time for questions now, and hopefully there are a few.
Sure. Mike, we did have a couple questions come into the chat, so I'll go ahead and ask those. But for now, I'll just remind folks that are on the line that you can ask a question by either raising your hand in the top left corner, and we'll address you, and you can unmute your phone line by pressing *7. You can also write us a question through the chat feature, which is at the bottom left side of the screen. But Mike, one of the questions that came in through the chat was, how do you prefer to present these results to legislators, given that you have some mixed results? So do you talk about it in terms of a return on investment, or do you present the cost-benefit ratio? How do you do it in Oregon?
Sure. And typically we've started off with whether or not a program is effective is really kind of the first way of looking at it, because if you have a program that's not effective and money is going into it, then that's easy. You don't even really need to do the work of the cost-benefit analysis. If you can say, we're doing boot camps and we've studied them and they don't work, and the research shows they don't work, that's a easier way to present it. Now, once we have evidence that something's effective, it has some positive impact on recidivism, then it matters a lot more what the costs and benefits are of those. So we've typically tried to we've kind of put together the portfolio. It's similar to what they've done in Washington, where we said these are the programs that that have an effect size that we're confident in, and these are our estimates of the criminal justice savings or avoided taxpayer costs and the victimization costs that are avoided with that. But we always try to caution as well. It's always the hard job as a researcher while you're trying to present these information to policymakers. They typically like to have one number to go with, and often it's more complicated than that. So we try to give them this information, and often there is one number that goes with it, along with our explanation of these costs vary. Some of them are difficult to estimate. The effectiveness of programs vary over time, so we try to caveat it to some extent, but not too much to where it's not useful. So I don't know if that helps answer the question.
I hope so. We have a question coming in from Valerie. So Valerie, you can just press *7 to unmute your phone line. And if you're there, you can go ahead and ask your question.
My question is whether you encountered many states that don't have the kind of detailed recidivism data that you showed in Table 4. And if that's the case, then what would you recommend to states that don't have this information?
Okay, so I would expect, and maybe I'm wrong here, most people I've talked to do have some recidivism data that they can measure. If you don't have, the way we look at it is if you have data systems as far as the Department of Corrections goes, you can look at the people that are released and figure out their SID number or their state ID number or some other tracking number, and so no one puts this sort of recidivism data out. I kind of go in and I gather this myself by looking at when they were released from prison or when they were sentenced to probation, and then counting how many times they are caught after that fact. And I would assume most states would have that, but if you don't have that, you could try to gather that with arrest data so you don't use conviction data. You could use arrest data instead. If you don't have that as well, I would have to think more about that, because I haven't dealt with a lot of states who don't have any recidivism data to track. It would be difficult to estimate the impacts and the dollar savings if you don't know which crimes you're expecting to avoid. That's really the way that this model has been set up in Oregon, is that's really a key component of knowing sort of how offenders, what types of crimes they recidivate in and how long out they recidivate. So if you have a program, you can apply that effect size and show what the reduction in recidivism would be and measure the cost. Now, if that data is not available, I'd have to think if there's some other creative ways of doing that. I haven't dealt with that before.
Thanks, Mike. We have a question that came in through the chat from Jennifer. So if Jennifer's there, she can go ahead and unmute her phone line by pressing *7 on your phone. And if she's not there, I can go ahead and ask her question. So Jennifer, are you there? Okay, I'll go ahead and ask the question.
Okay.
It was a question about how effect sizes differ from recidivism rates.
Okay. So a recidivism rate would just be looking at a cohort of offenders that are released from prison or sentenced to probation, and you follow them for some period of time, and you look at how many crimes they commit, and you can measure a recidivism rate. So what percent get reconvicted or rearrested, depending on what measure of recidivism you want to use. Now, effect size would look at recidivism rates and look at the difference in recidivism rates from a group that goes through a program and a group that doesn't go through the program. Now, taking the difference of those two recidivism rates, assuming your two groups are matched appropriately, will give you an effect size, an estimate of how effective that program is at actually reducing recidivism. So the effect size, recidivism, you need the recidivism data to figure out an effect size, but the two are are very different from one another. The effect size is measuring recidivism differences.
Okay, thanks, Mike. We have a question from Jimmy, and I actually can't pronounce his last name, so I'm not going to try. But Jimmy, if you're there, you can go ahead and press *7 on your phone to unmute your phone line. So Jimmy, are you there? Go ahead.
I'm here. Hello, Mike. This is Jimmy Stye out in
Hi,
Montana.
Jimmy. How you doing?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
Good.
Good. I just want a point of clarification on your Table 4.
Okay.
You define recidivism as a second conviction?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, so
that's my only question.
Yeah, it's a felony conviction, and now depending on, like I said, the data in your state or how you want to measure this, this table could have rearrests in it. It could include misdemeanors. You could have, like I have, multiple crime categories. You could have just person and property crimes. There's a lot of different ways of setting it up. So it doesn't have to be done identically to how we've done it in Oregon. This is the data we have available that makes the most sense for our analysis.
Right.
But there are a lot of different ways you could do it.
And you can still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So this you got from your corrections data?
Yeah. So I went to the Department of Corrections, and I basically have access to their data. So I looked at a state identification number of people who were sentenced to probation in 1997, and then I ran a program to find that person anytime they came in again for a new felony conviction, and then tabulated them by these different crime categories.
Okay.
But yeah, so I would assume, I know I've talked to, I presented some of this information in West Virginia a year or two, probably a couple years ago now, and they didn't track probationers in their state. So they wouldn't have information on all felony convictions. They only had information on those that got sentenced to prison, which would make it difficult to do this type of modeling. You could do the same type of modeling, but you would be leaving off all those that didn't get a prison sentence. So your benefits would be smaller than if you have richer data. As I have here, if I had misdemeanors in here, I would be calculating even more benefits to the programs, because many of these crimes that are committed and crimes that are being avoided from a program are misdemeanors, but I'm unable to track those.
Right.
Okay, thanks for your question, Jimmy. We have another question coming through the phone line, or coming through the chat, sorry, about whether you have any clean results. So the drug court example, I guess, was a little bit of a mixed result. Do you have any examples of clean cost-benefit ratios?
Sure. I mean, you could look at, we had a program that was called our alternative incarceration program, where we had, inmates got an early release if they successfully completed treatment, and we did an evaluation of that, and it was, I can't remember the exact effect size, it was around 20%. And so it was a really easy study, because the alternative incarceration program did two things. It said if you successfully went through treatment, then you got time off your sentence. So the program actually had a negative cost from that standpoint, because business as usual would have been in prison. If they complete the program, they got out early, and it reduced their recidivism. So you're able to measure both sides of it, that the costs were actually less than what business as usual would have been, and they had a positive effect on recidivism. So it was a really easy cost-benefit analysis of looking and saying this program, yes, reduces crime and reduces costs on both sides of the equation.
Thanks, Mike. We have another question coming in from Steve Butler.
Okay.
Steve, if you're there, you can go ahead and unmute your phone line. Otherwise, by pressing *7. Steve, are you there? Okay, I don't think he's there, but his question was about how to define recidivism in your studies.
Okay. So I'm getting feedback now. I don't know if you guys can all hear that. But when you look at revocation, we don't count that as a recidivism event unless it's a new crime. But to the extent that costs new money to the system, then we can count that.
Sorry, Mike, I'm getting feedback also.
Okay.
And we're trying to fix this on our end. Maybe we have 1 minute for another question. So if anyone has any other questions, you can go ahead and raise your hand or just chat to us. But Mike, maybe it'll be helpful to just end on a question that we had over here.
Sure.
How would you recommend replicating the model in other states, knowing what you know about Oregon's system? What would you recommend to folks that were looking to do cost-benefit capacity in other places?
Sure. The recommendations I would have are first of all to work with other partners in the criminal justice system. It really requires collaboration. For the model that I put together here, I have data from the state police. I have data from the Department of Corrections. I have program costs from the budget portions of the Oregon Youth Authority, the Department of Corrections. Some budget information comes from the Department of Human Services, some from the counties. So you have all these different places that you need to gather data from, which sometimes that can be the hardest part is working with all the partners, because typically there's, as probably many of the people on the phone know, there's these silos that people have their data and they don't share across these silos. So really working on relationships with those and other agencies is a vital first step to getting this information going.
Thank you so much, Mike. I think we're
Laura.
going to wrap up here. So just want to thank you so much also for presenting in this two-part webinar. I know it can be tricky to navigate the technology, but thank you so much. I'll just go ahead and review what we've done today. We've calculated the cost of an assault, reviewed a cost-benefit analysis of an Oregon drug court, and discussed how cost-benefit analysis can be used in decision-making. In the series, you've learned how to assess your jurisdiction's return on investment from incarceration and criminal justice expenditures. You've also learned how to calculate the cost of crime and the benefits of crime avoided, and you've become a more educated consumer of cost-benefit analysis. As a reminder, we'll ask you to complete the evaluation form as you exit this training. It really helps us design future webinars. And speaking of future webinars will feature the ingredients of cost-benefit analysis, including a webinar on evaluation and effect sizes, and an evaluation on marginal costs. So these will be great and not to be missed, so please follow us on Twitter, or you can visit our website, www.cbkb.org, which stands for the Cost Benefit Knowledge Bank for Criminal Justice. In the next week, you will receive an email with the recordings and slides from both trainings. You'll also be notified when these items are posted online. Here's my contact information if you have any questions about this webinar or any other questions about cost benefit generally. I want to thank the Bureau of Justice Assistance for their support in the development of CBKB and this webinar. I also want to thank Mike Wilson. It's really been great to work with you on these webinars.
Thanks, Laura.
So that is all for now. Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here and contributing to the conversation. Hopefully we'll see you on some of our other webinars. Thanks so much.